Hi students, welcome back again, and we're talking about the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty is a Chinese name, but it's the name that the Mongol rulers of China after Genghis Khan and Mongol Khan and Kublai Khan took for themselves. So it's a sign of how the Mongols are adopting aspects of Chinese culture, Chinese language, Chinese government practices, Confucian political philosophy. And this is part of a theme that we've seen throughout the China section of this class, where invaders, outsiders come into China from the north, they take control of China, and then they adopt Chinese culture. And with the Yuan dynasty, we see this especially strongly because the Mongols have this legacy of encouraging trade across Eurasia and encouraging the interaction between different groups of peoples. And so we see not only greater interaction between the Mongols and the Chinese during this period, but also between China and the rest of Central Asia and even in Europe. And so, for example, we see a greater interaction and greater presence of Muslims and Islamic learning, and the culture of education of the Middle East starts to play an influence and starts to become established in China. Middle Eastern learning in terms of these disciplines, cartography, the study of maps, astronomy, the study of the stars, very important for shamanic Chinese religious practices. Studying the stars was seen as part of communicating with the ancestors, and also with Middle Eastern medicinal learning. And we also see Western music being adopted and explored by the Chinese during this period. Western music and Western musical instruments. The Yuan, nevertheless, did not convert to Islam or to Christianity, but of the different religions and religious philosophies in China, they leaned most favorably towards Buddhism. However, we find them using Muslim civil servants to administer China and Chinese civil servants to administer provinces further west that had a higher Muslim population. And so this was a way of trying to keep your subordinates' loyalty. Remember that we've consistently throughout Chinese history seen this problem that conquerors face, that they conquer this large area with this great population. They have to subdivide, and then their subordinates who are ruling over these subdivisions become independent. This is the way the Yuan dynasty tries to overcome that, by subdividing their empire and then giving control of those subdivisions to people who do not have an identity that matches those they're ruling over. This is designed to prevent their subordinates becoming too politically independent. The Mongol government was a clear reflection of the practices of earlier dynasties. And so the government is divided into civil and military duties, but the Mongols retain their own courts of justice. So the Mongols have adopted significant aspects of Chinese culture. They've taken on Chinese names, but nevertheless they still identify themselves as Mongols and being distinct from the Mongols. And they still don't trust the Chinese, or they still wish to separate themselves from the Chinese in terms of trials and judgments. The Yuan also saw continued advances in science and technology. So we've seen this already with their interest in Islamic learning, but the Mongols are very interested in the learning and practices of other societies. And so we see advances in algebra, we see a more accurate calendar, a calendar that's only 26 seconds different from the modern calendar. We see Mongol, Chinese, and Western medicines and medicinal practices all being maintained in the Mongol Empire under the Yuan dynasty. So traditional techniques like acupuncture are spread throughout Eurasia as a result of the Mongol conquest. The society during this period was shaped by this interesting mix of Mongol and Chinese lifestyles. Almost all of the rulers are purely Mongols. Remember, these are people who are living on the steppe, who are purely nomadic up until only a couple of generations before. And so some Mongols continue to live in this way. Even though they're living in China, in this land that's much more densely populated with big cities, they're still living a nomadic lifestyle. However, others adopt the practice of building huge palaces and become more sedentary, following the example of the Chinese. Mongol garrisons rule over the countryside and live at leisure off the harvests, which is the agriculture that is carried out by the Chinese tenants. Of course, they also have a responsibility to provide military service and to provide soldiers for their superiors or for the emperor when they're required. Mongols also established 4 classes of reliability. They're trying to rule over this large and diverse empire. They're trying to know who they can trust. If you're a Mongol, you're highly trusted. If you're Simu, that means if you're Muslim, Christian, or some kind of foreigner, that means you're considered pretty trustworthy, that you're going to be more appreciative of power and authority that's entrusted to you by the Mongol rulers. You're probably not going to betray them. If you do, you don't have kind of a natural support structure that's going to send you to power or help you overthrow the Yuan dynasty. Han Chinese, who were from the Jin, were next. These were seen as a little suspicious. They're still ruling, the Mongols still saw themselves as ruling over the Chinese. The Jin they had conquered fairly quickly, but they still didn't especially trust them. And then least trusted of all were Han Chinese from the Song dynasty. And so these are the ways in which the Mongols at least understand the degree to which their rule is being accepted. Now, in general, this was a period of peace, but that's partly because of the ways the Mongols are trying to break apart threats to their authority. The Han Chinese, however, will return to rule over China with the rise of the Ming Dynasty in the mid-14th century. So the Yuan dynasty is going to decline because of growing resentment, of discrimination against the Han Chinese by the Mongols. So the Han Chinese start to resent these classes of reliability that the Mongols have set up, the fact the Mongols don't really trust them in positions of authority. So this is the flip side. Don't give these people positions of authority because you're worried they might become independent, and then potentially they rebel anyway. So there's resentment on the part of the Han Chinese, and then there are the failures of to govern and to maintain the infrastructure of China that I talked about in the last lecture. Failure to maintain the infrastructure leads to a weak taxation structure. It leads to some people seeing themselves as being overtaxed. This leads to further failures to maintain the infrastructure of China. There's serious flooding of the Yellow River. Remember that failure to control the Yellow River was always seen as a failure of political authority and of the ability to govern. Perhaps also the truth of holding the mandate of heaven in Chinese history. And these failures lead to a Peasant Rebellion in 1351. One of the leaders of this rebellion was one of the men who's one of the key terms this week, a man named Ji Yuanzhang, who is also a Buddhist monk. He joins, he's just a penniless peasant, but he joins a group called the Red Turbans, marries the daughter of one of the commanders, and shows himself to be a powerful, successful, effective military commander. And he captures the city of Nanjing in 1356. He then eliminates one of his chief rivals in one of the largest naval battles in history, a force of 200,000 against a force of 650,000. When Ji Yuanzhang wins this battle, it gives him control of the Yangtze River. Remember, the Yangtze River is increasingly the economic heartland of China. now that he controls the Yangtze River, no one is really able to contest his ambitions. And so he takes the name of the Hongwu Emperor, mercifully for me. That's a much easier name for me to manage. And he begins to rebuild the infrastructure and the unity of the Chinese Empire. So his significance is the restoration of Han Chinese rule to China after the period of Mongol rule. He's the one who initiates that, and he is the founding emperor of the Ming Dynasty. So he's going to build walled fortifications around the city of Nanjing. He's going to follow a Tang dynasty style of law and military structure. So he's going to revive the Tang law code in its fullness. The Mongols had kept some of it. He's going to revive the Tang structure of an imperial military. However, he maintains some aspects of the Yuan rule. He retains some of the Mongol practices of waging war, which of course had been so successful. And he keeps several Mongol and even Jurchen subordinates as high-ranking officers. He nevertheless presents himself as purifying China of the Mongol influence. So the Ming Dynasty is definitely born of resentment of the Mongol conquest of China. And of course, they're going to maintain the greatest legacy of the Mongols, which is the unification of China. But in other ways, they're going to very much build themselves as being a reaction to the Mongol rule. Hongwu secures the Chinese frontiers by expanding China southwest into a region which is more heavily influenced by the religion of Islam. And so that's going to become the relationship between the Chinese and the religion of Islam is going to be an important dynamic in the ongoing history of China. It's going to defeat the Mongols in Manchuria and secure the northern border, the border that always brings about political change and uncertainty. And he's going to achieve a certain degree of sovereignty over the area or the region of Tibet. And so in these conquests, in the establishment of the Tang law code or the revival of the Tang law code, in this rhetoric of purifying China of the Mongol influence but maintaining some aspects of the Yuan dynasty that have been successful, you see the Hongwu emperor establishing the stability or trying to re-establish the stability of Han Chinese rule over China of earlier successful dynasties like the Han and the Tang. We'll talk more about the Ming Dynasty and their rule and their government in the next video.